I have been doing field work for a really long time now, and I've noticed that I'm being asked increasingly often to give a kind of umbrella view of the worlds that I've worked in my long career. I think simply because I'm older than most of you, and I was out there early on. So I recently gave a talk about the Mazatec mushroom, evolution and changes as it came through this culture, and that got me thinking about the other peoples and knowledge systems and plants that I've worked with. And so let's see. I want to begin by telling you a myth that I learned when I first went to Peru in 1976. It was, and I use the word myth, with caution, because it's a reality for some people. But there is an origin tale or an origin myth for all the species that are important to human beings around the world, wherever people have cultures where they have deep ancestral relationships to a species of plant or animal. They have a story about how that species came to the people, how that was sort of pulled out of the intense network of all the other species and made special, and often that there are instructions associated with it that come and are restated every time that story is told. So the story I told in asking the first ayahuasquero that I worked with, and I'll back up a little in a moment and tell you how that came to be, but the story that I was told was that when I asked, how did the people learn to identify two different species in the jungle, far from each other, one of them in the lowlands in a shrub, one of them a big vine up giant trees, learn to identify them out of the tens of thousands of other species all around, and to combine them in a way that brings us this experience, this worldview, this set of rituals and practices that have been handed down. And he said, well, it was only 500 years ago, and that there was a great bird, a great huge white bird that sailed down over the upper jungle of South America from the Andes, and it came with a message. It came looking at different plants, and then it came to the people, and it told the people, change is coming. Big change is coming, and you need medicine so that you remember who you are and what you're doing here. And if you take this plant and you take that plant and you cook them together from sunset to darkness, then you will remember the thread of your identity. You will remember who you are and what you're here for. That was his explanation to himself and to that he had learned, and to his people, of how the medicine knowledge came to them of how to combine these plants. And I, over the years, I've thought of that many times, because I tend to look at motivation, what makes us go look, us, the outsiders who are now weaving our way into the inside of an ancient system and changing it, which is what this talk is really about. And what motivates us, what are we seeking, and to what extent is that the essential, the longing for an essential identity, and the longing for some ancient memory that we have broken with, even though it looks like most people in this room are not Amazonian in origin. We know that all of our ancestors were deeply connected to nature, had plants and mushrooms, maybe some kind of vision, maybe other kinds of insight that was gained from them, definitely ritual, definitely practices that proscribed certain behaviors and blessed other behaviors. All of these systems of song and design and poetry and all of those things that are part of these plant rituals, nature rituals of any sort. So we have this sort of, I feel, we do have this ancestral or genetic memory, every one of us. It's a broken thread, and we're hungry for that reconnection. We don't know where to look often, and then for a number of reasons, this particular complex, the ayahuasca complex, has risen to global attention. So here we are. So back to what motivated me at that time, I didn't use the word ethnobotanist yet. I had grown up in nature and knew a lot about observation, perception, careful, quiet perception of nature and the gifts of that. And I also had spent time as a little child and then as a late teenager in Mexico, and as in my early 20s hanging out with Indians in Mexico. But my psychedelic information was coming through it was the 60s. I graduated high school in 1966. It was in California. I mean, the right place to be at the right time, and I was right in the middle of it every minute. And then, as many thousands of others did, we found out with just a bunch of acid trips under our belts and knowing what good music was and all that, we found out across the world and became travelers and went out collecting connections, collecting experiences, telling tales, So I was part of that wave, which I am so grateful for. And in that period, I was hearing about, well, of course, I heard about the mushroom phenomenon in Huautla in Mexico, and I spent 6 months in Mexico, but I avoided going to Huautla because it already sounded like an invasion, and I didn't want to be part of an invasion. I tried to stay away from the Gringo Trail, as it used to be called. And but I had met on one of my travels years before, I had met Terence in Asia, and our paths parted, and we just heard of each other once in a while. And in 1975, I got a message delivered to me from him, want to go on an expedition to the Amazon? And that was the best date offer I'd ever had. So I said, absolutely. And we got together and took several dozen very strong mushroom trips to prepare, and then headed down there with no money, and one friend who I met as we got on the plane, who never has wanted his name revealed and was just sort of like our little quiet shadow. People used to ask me if he was my little brother, and I was taking care of him. So he was our odd companion, and the three of us spent several months then in the Peruvian Amazon. And, we were hapless. I mean, Terence had been to, some of you know about the whole La Chorrera adventure and all of that. That had already happened. But he hadn't explored ayahuasca. And he didn't speak Spanish. And he just was a different kind of traveler than I was. So I took kind of the guide role. And we got to Iquitos, we headed down the Amazon River, up the Napo, and we thought we had a plan, but it turned out that when one of the people on the boat of like 10 people we were on, one of the people threatened to kill another person, we said, you can just let us out right here on the bank. Well, that was our plan. So we bailed, and hoped that village of Indians would have ayahuasca, and stayed there some weeks. And we could see, I remember my idealism being bruised immediately, because the curandero for that village was always drunk on their own homemade chicha, masato, but day and night he was too drunk to walk on the trails in the forest. The children took me to look at the medicine plants, but they didn't know how to use them. And it was raining so much that they didn't have food this year. They couldn't plant. It was just raining constantly. And so I saw, this is a system, an archaic system in decay. And it took us a while to get back up the river, back to Iquitos. And at that point, maybe you know who Manuel Córdoba Rios was. He wrote, or had written about him, The Wizard of the Upper Amazon, and a couple of other books. And he was a renowned healer, 89 years old, I think, when I met him. So we went to him in Iquitos, and he was still treating people every day. And I said, we really would like to spend some time learning about ayahuasca, but we want to find a really authentic ayahuasquero and someone who's also willing to be a teacher, because we know we're asking a lot. And he said, and now this is, take it with a grain of salt, but he said, there's no one else in the Iquitos area that knows how to make ayahuasca anymore. They've all forgotten, only me. And if anybody who uses an aluminum pot, they don't know how. People don't know what all the songs are, and they don't know the spirits. But if you go 500 miles south to Pucallpa and then up toward the mountains, you'll find people who still know how to make it. That was his advice. So we did that. No small feat in those days. You can just hop everywhere on airplanes and find hotels. Meanwhile, in Iquitos, I had noticed that there were, it was a tiny town compared to what it is now. It was 100th the size of, it's 500,000 people now. And I had noticed that there were gringos, a few of them, no tourists. It was not appealing to tourists at all. Open sewage in the street. I mean, it was really funky. But there were these guys, they looked like Texas cowboys, and it turns out they were all oil people, and that was the beginning. Someone explained to me, an old timer there who seemed to know everything, explained to me that besides you three strange people who just arrived, every stranger in Iquito is either an oil man or the CIA. And so that was the beginning of the first huge oil boom in Peru, which was invisible to all of us because we didn't have the global political education or system to know about it. And it happened through the 70s. Terrible, terrible environmental things happened that affected cultures and rivers and whole populations of wild animals and just changed things radically. We're in the beginning of the second great oil boom in Peru right now, and it's also invisible unless you really look for it and pay attention to it. So we went down there, and he had told us, find this woman. I worked with her once. She had leprosy. She lost her arms, she lost her hands and her feet, but through taking ayahuasca, she was able to stop the leprosy and not make it go any farther. So she's a fantastic healer. She has to be carried everywhere. She has to have everything done for her. But she's the best healer I can recommend with ayahuasca. So we went looking for her, but she had been carried deep into the mountains to work with some tribal people up there. And I had already learned that when you want to know something deeper about a village or a people, go into the marketplace and go to the herbalists and go to the oldest herbalist. It's still my method. I recommend it, especially if you speak the language. And we found the oldest herbalist and, had to get to know her. But I said, do you go to someone for ayahuasca? Do you participate in ayahuasca ceremonies? And she, with great caution, said, yes, she did. She had her own ayahuasquero, and she would ask him if she could bring us to meet him. So this all took several days, and then eventually we went out west of Pucallpa into the forest with her, and it turned out that there was a community led by an indigenous ayahuasquero, but with some mestizo people. Mestizo, are mixed blood people, and it was a mixture of different indigenous folks and a few mestizo people. So it was already a new kind of community, a syncretic community. Everything that I saw in 1976 was already syncretic, going through this weaving of influences. And I had to give up any notion I had of like pure tribal, unbroken lines of knowledge. But I saw amazing things. I mean, it was wonderful. She took us to Don Fidel Mozambique. I'm not showing you any slides here. How do I do that? Okay. Yes, curiosity about shamanism. Oh, well, you can... Okay, go back one, okay? I may just talk and then go through my slides because they're... Can you go back? Thank you. So I was motivated to answer that question by wanting to find that thread for myself, that broken thread, and wanting to understand the worldview of people who kept it alive. And I think my work all my life has been I'm not a scientist. I am based in nature. I do know a lot about plants. I do work in hardcore botany too, but it's really to understand the worldview. How do we see the world? What do we believe is real? That's kind of the key question in a worldview, because every worldview has a different definition, a different array of what is real, what is to be taken to heart and held and acknowledged and feared and believed in. So these deep fieldwork expeditions, of which this was one of the greatest I've ever been on, were really to see if I could glimpse the world through the eyes of people who saw it very differently and who were grounded in nature, that combination. And in that community, where we stayed for 10 weeks, I found that. I found it with this Kokama indigenous ayahuasquero, Don Fidel, and the people who came every week. His method was to have a community session every Saturday night, and about 25 or 30 people from the surrounding community, not a village, they were just scattered through several miles of jungle. They would come together walking on paths and get together in the one clapboard house there was. All the rest were just, palm huts with often no walls. But the old herbalist lady had a house with walls, and we would gather there. And he would administer the ayahuasca, which he had just brewed that day or that week, and he would sing his wonderful songs of invocation. Some of you know this kind of thing, although it differs with each practitioner and each tradition. Invocation and protection, and he would work with whistling and blowing and the shakapa and bringing the wind, aventar, to bring the wind, to invoke freshness. And he sometimes had to defend people, sometimes had to purify people. All sorts of things went on. Sometimes we had big drama in those sessions, but it always sealed up well. And his condition for us, he had only one time ever had an outsider before, and the whole time in Pucallpa, we never saw another outsider. So that was 10 weeks of coming in and out. We lived out in the jungle, but we'd come into Pucallpa maybe 2 days a week. And so there was no tourism. There was nothing like that. And he said one time a person who, had the notion to canoe down the Amazon, an American, had heard about ayahuasca. This was a couple of years before we got there, and come there, and they'd said, well, he seems like he has a good heart. Okay, we'll have him for an evening. And an hour into it, this young man ran, just completely freaked out, and ran screaming from there and left all of his gear and backpack, and they never saw him again. They tried to stop him, but he disappeared. So they were not very interested in having outsiders because they looked at us as very, very fragile. So we had to have several days of discussions with him, kind of to show our philosophical depth and experience. Of course, we had lots of LSD experience, but he didn't know what that was, so that didn't really qualify us for anything. And but one thing I want to tell you is that was interesting also is on the Wednesday night of every week, he had a session that didn't involve the community. I was privileged to be able to go. Sometimes Terrence came to it. But he did invite other old healers, other people who were known for their songs. We'd have just 3 or 4 guests, and they were always exalted guests. His teacher, an older ayahuasquero, whom he revered, would come sometimes. Usually we would drink Don Fidel's brew, which by this time we were brewing with him or watching, learning. But sometimes if the person was honored enough, they would bring their own brew, and we would all try it together, and it would be reviewed like a fine wine. They would talk about everything from the color and the texture to the smell to, of course, the visions and the songs and all that. But also these other old healers who would come a distance and stay for a day or two would exchange songs. There was this respect between the knowledgeable ones, the people of knowledge, to exchange certain key things as though they were tools. and to share them with each other if they really shared respect. And I found that so interesting because since many times in shamanic situations I've seen that it's classic in the literature, the boasting and the envy and the establishing power and domain and all of that, which is also a very well-known part of classical shamanism around the world. You know, nobody does it as well as I do, and my songs are better, and we don't want him near here because he'll drain the energy or whatever, those kinds of attitudes which are typical and worldwide. So this was a study group. It was like this, kind of, you know. It was where experts come together and willingly share with other people whom I'm sure they've vetted carefully or they wouldn't be there. And I remember they had each traveled a lot, and one particularly, a man who knew some amazing songs in other languages, because most of these songs were in Quechua. There were songs in a couple of other languages, but, and I wrote down some of the songs very carefully since I didn't know Quechua, but syllable by syllable, working with him, with Don Fidel. But I remember one man said, 20 years ago, I worked my way down the river just to see what the world was like, and I got to Brazil down in the middle somewhere, and I went off with the Xingu tribe, and I was with a Xingu woman for several years. I think I gave her a baby or two, and she gave me a song, and this is the song. And then sang this beautiful, incredible song in sounds like I have never heard before or since, and everyone was just awestruck, and then he taught it to them so it would become part of their toolkit, you know. So that was, and there was much talk, of course, about spirits. One time there was a moment of darkness. Suddenly, it was the dark of the moon, or it was the moon was out. We're inside with walls. They never had any light. It was always dark. But clouds covered the moon, so it just got pitch black inside. A dog started barking just nearby. A baby just leapt into howls of fear, and all these things happened within a few seconds. And Don Fidel jumped to his feet and just started trembling so hard that the whole building on its little pillars was shaking. And that went on for a couple of minutes with chanting and whistling, but shaking, this trembling. That the whole group, it was one of the big groups, we were all just trembling like crazy. And then it was over, and then it was gone, and promptly the moon came out, the baby quieted, the dog stopped, and they named it. Everybody knew what it was. So for me, 26 years old, I was really learning a lot about what's real for certain other people, how do you react to it, whether or not you choose to believe it's real, or, you know, whether I knew how to identify whatever it was that surrounded us in that moment. I knew that something surrounded us, and something needed to be done, and something was done, and it worked. That's what I knew. So that's where I was like, okay, there's this operational reality for people where they identify and recognize forces that are beyond most of our ability to define them, but they're real enough that a collective of people all saw it and all worked with it and all felt it leave again. And then over the ensuing weeks and months, I learned a lot more about protection. And so I'm going to finally show you a few slides and jump through here. How am I doing on time? Half an hour already, okay. Botanical Dimensions, we started later, an organization. I won't spend much time on this, but this has been going on for almost 30 years now, this organization that Terrence and I started, and I've continued. The purpose is to protect and propagate the plant species that are in danger, but their lore has always been really important to me, and that's part of what I've just been telling you. This is plant lore. This is what people know. This is almost as transitory, or maybe more so, as these species which are going extinct at 3 species per day, they estimate, are going extinct right now. Well, knowledge is going extinct even faster, you know. So it's changing too. It's turning into something else. It doesn't just disappear, but it is imperiled. So I'll say more about that. Let's go on. We're doing an herbarium project in Iquitos, we meaning some Peruvian botanists that I work with, and a couple of people here in the States, and working with an herbarium, scanning, making a library, a digital library of the images of the plants in this big pressed plant collection in Iquitos, okay? And connecting it up with ethnographic information, ethnobotany, how people use these plants, the chemistry and the pharmacology of it too, and creating a database that will then be publicly available and hopefully add to the valuing of what's in the Amazon as it's in this delicate state where they're still disappearing very quickly. Okay. Diploteris, as you know, is one of the other admixtures to ayahuasca, and so this is just an example of one of the plants that's in there. And I'm really interested in varieties. The category below, more finely detailed even than species, because the varieties of a species are what the people of a region recognize and use and call upon for spiritual reasons, medical reasons, all sorts of reasons, practical ones better for weaving, etc. And botanists don't have such a fine comb usually to be able to see these varieties. So it's a kind of folk knowledge. This is again around the world that's really refined and valuable and vulnerable. Okay. Systems of knowing, and I won't explain that, it would take too long, but there are people who have studied ways of knowing, ways of perceiving. This relates to this interest in worldview and perception and what is it, and this idea that we only perceive what we believe is real. So in this ayahuasca revolution sort of that's going on, that's infused so many of us, we're having our categories of what is real jostled, and we're trying in a rather confused way, it seems, but that's understandable, to accommodate other ways of seeing and interacting with forces that we never imagined before and that our friends and peers may not recognize either. And also we're projecting, because that's what we as humans do as well. We project what we want to see. So we're projecting identity, we're projecting values, we're projecting goodness or badness or whatever onto these mysterious forces, entities, places, things, plants, people, human beings. That's, you know, that's a big challenge. That's where a lot of our kind of danger and wrestling and ego and loss of identity and all these things come up. I feel like I'm saying so much in such a short little phrase, but okay. But sorry I can't carry on. Those are wonderful old couples still alive, the Whittons, who studied the Canela, who lived with and studied with the Canela Quichua in Ecuador for a very long time and studied their ways of knowing, among other things. One thing I've always, I think it's because of the way I grew up, I've always tried to look at are the subtle plants, not the big showy, I'm the most important plant around plants, and the same with the people. Who are the ones who are peripheral to the designated knowledge holder, to the guy in charge usually, you know? And of course often they're women, but they're often men too. They're people who don't boast and who don't have a title, and everybody doesn't come to see them, but somehow they're always there. They're always facilitating. They actually know a lot. And this woman who never gave her name, just La Abuelita, the little grandmother, I worked with her a little bit back in the early 90s when I went back to the Amazon for quite a while. And she taught me to pay attention to the subtle. She said, it's so much about intuition. When you're walking down a trail in the forest and something catches your eye, you turn aside, you touch something. You're thinking, you're talking maybe even, but you reach out and you touch something. Or something whaps you in the forehead. Or you suddenly have an inspiration to turn and step off and sit down on that log right there. That's the unbidden voices that are speaking to you. That's what you should pay attention to. She said, you people like you from wherever you come from, you always have, you know, your You know where you're going, you know where you're headed, you know what you want to find, you know what you'll see, and you miss so much, So listen to these little clues all along the way. Well, that kind of knowledge, see, I regard as like absolutely precious. And this was, 18, 17 years after my first adventures in the Amazon. And it's when I really understood something about my earlier adventures as well, that there was this conversation going on between all the species all the time, and that the humans were just one little voice in that conversation. And just like the boasting ones, we think we're the most important and we think it's about us. But that's been one of the great lessons that indigenous people in other places have displayed to me as well, and made me slow down, listen, pay attention. When I'd wake up in the morning here, she'd say, "What did you dream?" And then we'd talk about my dreams, because she said, if you don't think about what you dreamt, it's kind of like you're just missing half your day, and half of what you're learning. Okay. This is Don Fidel in a more recent photograph that a friend of mine took. He's now 89, I believe. So go on to the next one. And he talked about varieties, and Psychotria viridis, and the little features on the back of the leaf that designate certain qualities in the folk ethnobotany way of seeing it, that the numerology of each plant and its parts has a spiritual or a knowledge kind of potency. So those are the kind of details that attention to subtlety and attention to variety will give you. Okay. And then all the different varieties of the vine of ayahuasca, which you've heard about, cielo, or the red and the black and the yellow, and all of those, and their spiritual qualities. These are not distinguished by botanists. It's hard to distinguish them. I've tried, but they are distinguishable, and they certainly are in the medicine. So I'm sure some of you have experience with that. Okay. And then I want to be sure to remind you what I was reminded at the beginning, way back when I started studying this, that the thing that's really unique about ayahuasca compared to, there are psilocybin mushrooms, and each species has a different ratio of psilocin to psilocybin to baeocystin, or whatever the chemical of that particular species is. But we can isolate psilocybin, and that's what's used in these new medical studies now. Or iboga root and ibogaine can be isolated, and peyote, and it has many alkaloids in it, and so does San Pedro or Chuma, but you can isolate mescaline from that, and so if you wanted to standardize for a scientific study, there's maybe something lost, that's certainly an argument, but there's something that can be isolated and standardized so that a study can happen. But why do we not have these kind of chemically based standardized studies of ayahuasca? Ayahuasca is never the same twice, even if it's the same chef with the same bushes and vines that he's drawing from that are in his acre or his backyard or hers, because each bush, each variety, each species, because there are also many different species that are added to various brews of ayahuasca, the cooking time, what it's cooked in, the time of day, the wood that it's cooked on. When I was there, we cooked over wood, and they always talked about whatever we were burning was part of the medicine. What you chose, everything you put into it. And then all the thought, all the intention, the whistling, the heart, the authenticity of character of the person making it. The intention is just in the medicine. So it's sort of, I compare it to minestrone, I've made minestrone 100 times or more in my life, and, I learned the recipe from my grandmother, but nobody ever makes it exactly the same twice, right? The ingredients are a little different, the timing, the people tasting it, the mood you're in, everything goes into it. So on the physical and the spiritual levels or psychological levels, and it's the same with ayahuasca. It is always a synergy. If the plant is growing in a different place, it's bringing very different earth energy. It's got, in some places there is no calcium in the soil. In other places it's calcium rich. This creates a different chemical profile. So it's very interesting to, every time you take it, know that it's a unique brew. Maybe they'll brew up 3 bottles at one time, and so there will be 3 bottles that have the same thing, but the next week it will be slightly different. That's one of the unique things about it. One of the things I learned in those days, and I don't know if people talk about this still, but is to watch the brew itself as at every stage in the 12 hours we cooked from sunrise to into the dark. And because the Amazon is a world made up of above the water and under the water, that's their reality. The land is just this little skin that appears and disappears with the rising and falling water. So all the beings, both spiritual and physical, like us, are in relationship to the surface of the water. That's kind of what we think of as the ground here. And during these sessions, the idea would be that you're calling on the underwater world to embrace you, or to relate to you, at least. I mean, there are all sorts of warnings about getting taken by the underwater people because they like humans, and the moment you go underneath, you'll forget that you're human. You may stay there for years. They love to marry us. But on the other hand, it's an interpenetration of levels, and that you see this in the surface of the brew, and as it starts to get ready, this is actually 1976 brew that we were making, the iridescence on the surface, and then these big oily bubbles start to appear and slowly turn like this as it's just simmering, and they're thick and they look like eyes, and they say, see, those are the fish eyes. They're coming up. The beings from underneath are coming up to see, oh, you're coming. Oh, who's coming? Oh, you're coming. And kind of like invite us down in. Okay. And then, of course, the metaphorical part of these we're quite aware of, that all the names that go into ayahuasca, which, soga, amarga, the bitter rope, the huasca means vine or rope, and aya is soul or death, and so all of these are different ways of interpreting the form here. Okay. And the flower, and I always try to look, because I really love and know plants, I try to look at the strategy of the plant species, the botanical entity, and how that factors in its, into its apparent survival strategy, which not all plants depend on humans at all, of course. They're doing their own thing with other plants and animals, but some plant species, a number of them, have tied themselves into our needs, have tied their needs into our needs, and we depend on them. Look at the ones that we've domesticated, that we eat every day. Look at what we wear. Look what we build our houses out of. I mean, this is ethnobotany, right? It's the plants that have come to the surface for us, upon which we depend, and then which we also steward, and some often manipulate as well. Maybe we're manipulated by them, hard to say. But ayahuasca, and the way it propagates, it makes these beautiful flowers. It doesn't set seed very readily. It makes the flowers up in the canopy, so you don't see the seed. You don't see the flowers very often. I've never actually seen a live seed. I've seen a lot of flowering ayahuasca. It propagates vegetatively, not sexually, which would be by flowers and genes and pollination and all of that, but vegetatively, meaning by slips or cuttings or nodes being transferred around. And so this diaspora, what I like to think of as the ayahuasca diaspora, that it's spread all over the world, is been spread vegetatively by people who think they're doing it for themselves, perhaps, but maybe we're doing it for the species or the family, that species or family. Maybe we're all for all these reasons. Who knows how this, if it's a plan, how the plan works. But the physically carry little bits of the plant to another place, and we propagate them, and it grows, and we cut it up and we give it to somebody else and it grows. We are the carriers, just like a furry animal that has seeds sticking to its back and runs a mile and then rubs on a tree, and then the seeds start up there. We're the carriers of the vegetative propagation of this vine, and of the knowledge, as well, as funky as our grasp of it is. And then you can go to the next one, thanks. And then that's pretty much how it goes with Psychotria, which is one of the two main DMT-containing plants, of course. It sets seed. These are its berries. It's related to coffee. It looks very much like coffee, if you've seen coffee growing. But the seeds are not very viable, and it is very viable vegetatively by leaf cuttings. So it's interesting that both of these species require something to pick up a piece of its body and move it to another place and plant it and let it grow roots, and then do that again and again. And it is moving around the planet in the same way. The brew is, the worldview is, the medicine is, where it's picked up by humans and it's brought to another place and takes root, branches, and then moves on again. So, it's a way of trying to understand how, in the big picture, how evolutionary strategies for different plant families and plant species work. And when you add that it's a powerful mind and heart affecting medicine, that just makes that botanical methodology even more interesting. I tend to raise questions more than I give answers, so I hope it's okay that I'm raising a bunch of things to think about. Okay. Excuse me. Some years after that time in the Amazon and some, incredible insights in the ceremonies and witnessing some fascinating human dramas there. In another era of my life, making the medicine, I had one of the most beautiful visions I've ever had, and I know we all have, our stunning and favorite tales. So, but I just, for a very sustained, the whole trip was just amazing, but then I actually was in a little circle, and I left the circle, and I just went out and looked up into the heavens and the starry sky, and for many minutes, maybe 15 minutes, eyes open, I just saw this huge heart, like a human heart, out in the cosmos, beating and sort of fluttering with these gorgeous banner ribbons blowing in a breeze behind it. And I remember thinking, because I felt clear as a bell, I remember thinking, the universe has a heart, like a person? Okay, this must be me projecting humanity onto the universe. I'm enough of a scholar that I can question myself in the middle of a trip, but but it was like, yep. And isn't it beautiful? And just remember this, and it still gives me the chills. It was just like, okay, whatever that means, if there is a beating heart in the center of the universe and it's perceivable and memorable, then that's kind of going to be my guiding symbol while I go on exploring and teaching, So when I saw this picture taken by the Hubble telescope a few years ago of one of the incredible things in our heavens, I just thought, it was quite a bit like that. So I'm going to share that. Okay. And, this is beyond my field work, okay, but I speculate readily. So, do any of you study physics a little bit or read at least popular physics? Yes, and that big question comes up all the time. Dark matter, dark energy, maybe we saw some. Was that some? Who can tell? We think we have the tool, we're almost going to be able to see the most invisible thing there is, of which everything is made. See that little tiny white wedge? That 0.4%, not even 1%, that's stuff. That's stars, planets, us, everything you care about, all our beloved crap, all of that stuff. That's in the 0.4%. So, and then, almost 4% is gas, and then everything else is either dark energy or dark matter, and this is all in our imaginations. So, I mean, educated imaginations. But so that's where I love that that scientists are trying to figure this out, and this is it's taken incredibly as science, and that we're trying to figure out, sort of in a way, what's real also, and this whole idea of the spirits, which of course there's not time to talk about, but the introduction that I had to animism, to how animism has come into our culture in that time since I was first down there, and how we now, again, because I think all our ancestors did, but we again now hold the possibility that everything is alive and intelligent and communicating, that I think we get into trouble when we divide things up into good and bad, or menacing and beneficent. That's sort of a tendency of ours, to make everything black and white and line up what we like and what we don't like and be afraid of what we don't like. And I think it's trickier than that. The way I have understood it from my times in the Amazon is really that, yes, there are essences, there are spirits or intelligence or whatever you want to call them in all of these species, in the water, in the stone, in the ancestors who show up to watch over you in different ways, whether you know it or not. All of that is there, but they're all, just like all of you, they're all to be communicated with. They're all a little ambiguous, and part of the shaman's job, a good ayahuasquero who's watching over her flock, would be to negotiate, to coax and brush off these different spirits. But it's like negotiation is the word, I guess. It's a way of saying, could you be helpful? Would you come and be helpful, please, in this situation? Or, no, I don't think that that's really what we need here tonight. Could you go do something else? But sometimes one that is not helpful one time is another time, because everyone has their skills, also in the spirit world. It's not black and white, and I think that's kind of the point I'd like to make there. Is we tend to so quickly, we humans, divide everything up that way, and that's an old habit. And one thing I didn't say, backing up, is that ayahuasca it wasn't the same for 10 or 15,000 years before gringos showed up, by any means. All of the Americas have only been inhabited, as far as we know. The date has been moved back now to 20,000 years, when people first started coming over from the Bering Straits and all of that, and very quickly moved all the way down through the Americas to the tip. So quite possible there have been people all through the Amazon, as 18, 20,000 years ago. Everything, the plants were there long, long before. There was a huge inland sea that filled the Amazon for, several million years, and then drained. And that's why you can find shells in the ground, seashells. And, it's been all sorts of things. The plants had to all come back. They kept on differentiating and evolving. And then people came in, and then people began to learn these plants. So that's all been, in a dozen thousand years. And agriculture started on 12,000, 10,000 years ago in the Amazon as well. We know the Andes and the Amazon were both rich, early agricultural areas. So this notion of, ancient wild knowledge, it has always been in flux. And huge populations were sustained by agriculture in the Amazon 6,000 years ago, 7,000 years ago, much bigger than there are now in the forested areas, and they were not all forested, and wars were fought. We know in I think it was, let's see, I don't want to say it wrong, but I think it was about 2,000 years ago at the most, that huge, well-fed armies of people, 60,000 people with poison darts, warriors were marched up the Amazon to take over the upper sections, the area where Peru and Ecuador and upper western Brazil are now, and conquered people who were living much more in little bands in the forest there. Meanwhile, the Incas and the Quechua, the Incas with the Quechua language were coming down from the mountains and down the rivers. The Quechua language being the language of all of Western Amazonia in terms of this ayahuasca complex there, that's a conqueror's language. The people who were there before were conquered, and there were many, I think 90-some languages spoken in the area we now call Peru, just not very long ago, and a few hundred years ago. Quechua was still moving down when the Spanish came in, and they threw a whole bunch of, medieval folk religion and Catholicism on top of all those layers, and that's in the ayahuasca too. You're getting parts of that. Some of that dark and light stuff, that's medieval Spanish thinking, and we can't even unweave the threads that make the worldview that we're observing now. They've all been layering over each other and weaving into each other and exchanging songs and taking slaves and doing all that stuff with each other. And then the Europeans added their layers on, and we're one of those layers. And oil raping is one of those layers. And the people who are reaching out to us now, and we're reaching in, and they are responding by coming here, by sending their medicine, or us taking it and running with it and changing it. This is a long evolution of constant syncretic change. And so I feel we have a responsibility to know the story we're in. And there's a tendency for Americans or for, European descendants, because we're the privileged people on the planet in terms of this percentages, to just think we know what we want and go and get it, and think, well, if we pay for it, well, then we're clean, or if we have good intentions, which are not very deeply examined usually, then we're clean, And I think it's really important to know this is a very long and complicated story, and we're only in the middle of it. And we each, me too, have a responsibility to be aware of the character that we are being in that story and how we're carrying ourselves, what effects we're having as far as we can see them. They're hard to detect, but that's why we're talking about it. And what do we carry onward? Good intentions that are not, we only perceive what we believe is real. We don't perceive all of our own selves either. And so this kind of like trying to see through the layers and using, of course, for your own protection, discernment. This is what I tell my students is like, I'm a mom enough that I feel protective of people too. So when you're heading out there to have your revelation, you really have to use all those techniques of intuition, discernment, look both ways before you cross the street. That kind of old kindergarten knowledge, use it when you're going out into that world, because it is filled with danger. It is filled with people who are who don't have your best interests in mind. It really is. And it not packed with them, but there's plenty of them out there. And it's our responsibility to be aware and to really watch our own step and to watch out for our friends or our best allies that we go with, and know who your allies are. Working on who's your ancestral ally, whether you believe that's real or not. And I know that people who take ayahuasca tend to believe a lot more things are real than the average American does. But if you believe if you have the capacity to believe that such thing might be real, that you might actually have a spiritual ally who might be your great-grandmother or someone in your lineage, a global concept that we all had only a few generations ago, then cultivate that relationship. Take that person with you when you go on this great psychic adventure, It's just, there's so many things we can do to be more conscious and careful, and care for the plant, care for the world, care for ourselves, care for, the ones that we love, but also to care for the last of the carriers of whatever people remember in this tradition at any stage. And that's where I feel so lucky that I was there so early, even though it was only a moment ago in the long history, but because I just saw something that has, in a lifetime, transformed so that we have a very different world in the Amazon now than we did just 40 years ago. And please pay attention. Just whip on through all of these. I want to show you one more slide. Okay, see, I was going to talk about all those things. Okay, keep going to the maps. Notes, these are notes. Okay, there. This map here, and I'm just going to give the little environmental thing for my closing comment. That is Peru. You see there's a language map of Peru, of the languages that still existed in diminishing amounts in only 2010, each of those colors, patches being a language group. And over here, this I just downloaded last night, this is the oil concessions that have been sold since 2010. So 82% of the Amazon has now been sold in contract to oil companies around the world for natural gas and oil. And much of those are on indigenous lands that are already set aside and promised to indigenous people, and much of them are in the few remaining national park preserves of Peru. It's knowledge you have to hunt for, and please do, and make some way of making your opinion known about it, and be aware of it when you go, or when you take the brew too, because it's the other kind of blood from the Amazon, is the petroleum and ayahuasca, and they somehow, they're related. So conscience about all that. Thank you so much, everybody. Time for any questions? Okay, I thought my question time was gone. Yes?
Another question is you're talking about spirits and that some spiritual ingredient of the plant is lost by psychopharmacologists making chemical extractions. Are these plants happy about being cultivated and moved to another state, or does any spirituality lost by them not being native and wild plants? And also, as with cannabis, when it was moved from India, it's been greatly enhanced by PhD botanists all over the world. Are these plants in any way enhanced by moving them by botanists to other places? And a really quick little question. Are any of those indigenous plant people vegetarians?
No, I just heard last night from somebody, the only vegetarians in the Amazon are really bad hunters. Sorry, I just heard that. I thought it was good. Excuse me. Well, I can't explain how it works, so don't ask me to do that. But I have the sense, as I imagine many of you do, that there is a kind of a will in ayahuasca, in the brew, in the plants that make the brew, to reach out into the world. I mean, that's a perception that if you take it there or here, it has this. I hope that some of you agree with me here. It has this quality of like the diaspora ready to send itself. Diaspora means to send their spores or your parts across the territory, to reach out farther. And, many of us, I think, feel, well, that's because the world is so desperately in need of medicine. And so the medicine arose and reached out and put itself in front of us. It's up to us then to know how to care for it and how to use it well. If I were just being a scientist and saying, Well, it's human. I would have to probably say it's apparently the human desire, the human zeitgeist to need help. And so we out here who didn't have these traditions went and found a tradition, and we're mining it and bringing it out. That is also happening. And but my perception in the state is that there is a will in the synergy of the plants, and that they are reaching out into the world. I'm sometimes dismayed by that, honestly. I mean, I've spent years, not so much anymore, but feeling like what was disappearing was so wonderful and purer, and, you know, I had a nostalgia for what was leaving. But I'm trying to be open-minded and optimistic that that medicine knows what it's doing, whatever kind of medicine. In the peyote ceremonies I've been in, they say that's on the road. You follow the medicine, stand behind the medicine, don't get in front of the medicine ever. The medicine has more wisdom than you do, no matter how experienced you are. And so I try to hold that attitude with the ayahuasca too. I don't know about enhancing it. I think it's pretty darn rich and complicated all by itself. You know, the brewing is the thing that the humans do that the plant can't do. Plants can't put themselves together. We put them together. So that's where our skill, that and knowing how to manage, to some extent, to ride these waves and to take care of each other while we learn by riding these waves, that's also human skill. That we can get a lot better at.
But it's not sacrilegious to move them and cultivate them?
Sacrilegious. I don't know to whom or what. I don't know. I think it's just bigger than us. You had a question right here first.
Yes. My question is, do you feel that there's a sort of a superordinate wisdom then that is directing and has for thousands of years mixing these plant ingredients together then, beyond just the spirits and the plants themselves?
Well, sort of like, what is the big white bird? Who said yes? I mean, clearly those people, the people who've had it for thousands of years, think, yes, there's some greater intelligence that told us how to do it and told us to do it for a reason. I guess I'd just have to say, I don't know, but it seems quite possible. Mm-hmm. Yeah, back there. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. He has it, and then I'll pass it to you, okay?
So it's hard for a lot of our botanist friends to attribute intentionality to plants. And I remember reading very recently that scientists have discovered that parts of the Amazon that we thought were wild for forever are actually more like gardens. And despite the biblical connotations and potential patriarchal things, do you think the garden metaphor and us as caretakers of the Amazon is useful in this dynamic of riding human intentionality with what the plants are doing?
Good question. Thank you. Yes, I do think it's useful. And if you look at contemporary ecological literature that's actually looking at how ecologies, whole systems of living things in landforms have been managed for a very long time, there's this concept. It was based on a study of how ancient California was managed by native peoples, but it's called tending the wild. Look up that phrase and you'll find writing about it. Tending the wild is this many thousands year back relationship between the human population that dwells in a region and the land and elements in that place. And it's a conscious effort to affect it for the betterment of the land and the animals and the plants and the humans. So it's before cultivation, long before, ever since the hunting and gathering days. So we've been hunting and gathering for like 200,000 years as in the period that we call ourselves human, and we've been cultivating domesticated wild species and doing actual agriculture for 10 to 12,000 years. So there were 190,000 years approximately, that we worked with the wild. And that meant pruning this so that would grow better, removing a few rocks here so the water would pool better, putting them back at the end of the year, burning. You've heard about the burning in California, seasonal burning that would burn off the old thatch and reduce the number of blights and things that would attack the oaks and the acorns. I mean, everywhere around the world this happened. And it's been a revelation to understand it just about in the last 15 years. And now they're applying this model, and everywhere they look, people have been tending the wild for as long as they've been there. And so that's the garden part. It's a wild garden. It wasn't all, geometric fields by any means, but when they look from satellite, they can see all that terra preta, that old biochar that's still there in huge patterns in the Amazon. It has to be seen from on high with certain kinds of, infrared and all that stuff, but it's still there because it's the remnant of great populations that were able to feed themselves and manage the forest. What I see now in Iquitos, I'm going down there every summer working on this herbarium project, and I'm just so dismayed in the open market, which they still have on the edge of the river, where they bring out the fish they've caught and the animals they've raised, or more often the animals they've caught, the wild ones. I see they're all skinned and stripped and everything, but they've got their paws or claws or beaks. And I've seen animals that I've never seen before on there. And when I've asked some of the vendors what they are, they say, we don't know. We don't know what they are. We just eat everything now. And sometimes things we ate 2 years ago, we can't find anymore. So we eat the next thing, And they say, we just eat it. We eat all of it. And of course, the question is, well, they're getting darn little and weird what you're eating now. So what happens in another 5 years or 10 years or whatever? And that's population. The population is fed partly by the oil boom and all that stuff, but that's just destruction from human beings and overpopulation. It will self-destruct in some way, and it's all ebb and flow. I look at ice ages when I get depressed, because that reminds me that 97% of everything can get wiped out in a meteor or freeze to death, and give it 500,000 years, and guess what? You've got, something nice again. So it's perspective. Yeah. Done. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.